Hi there, my name is Ron Rogers, and this presentation is titled United Airlines Flight 227. The accident board totally missed the point. And as an interesting side to that, the FAA actually got a few things right. If you want to know where some rules have come from, this is a very interesting accident. And the more I looked into this, now, I was hired at United Airlines in 1979, and every pilot there knew about K-Meyer and Salt Lake and the 727. That was just one of our famous accidents. But it's interesting, the more I looked into it, more where some rules came from. And that's very interesting. Now, this occurred on November 11th, 1965. It was the second accident that United Airlines had involving the 727. And in this accident, they had... of the 85 passengers on board and a crew of 6, there were 43 fatalities, including 2 passengers who succumbed in the hospital several days after the accident. The 48 survivors included all crew members. Now, I had a commenter call me a dinosaur, and okay, yeah, I probably am. But if I'm going to be a dinosaur, I'm going to be this dinosaur. Because go ahead and try to take my parking place. I'll rip you a new sunroof, okay? I've seen Jurassic Park. I know how it comes out. Okay, but guy called me a dinosaur and said, I don't care about any accident before 1990. Well, if you don't care about history, Bucky, you're going to repeat it. Now, let's talk about the 727. 727 was coming on the scene, and it's a fast, high-performance, slick aircraft, and a lot of the pilots at the time, the captains who were in charge, were coming off the DC-6, and were having a little trouble adapting to this higher-speed aircraft, and K-Meyer was no exception. The captain, he had a little trouble transitioning to jet aircraft 727, and they worked with him a bit and finally said, enough of that, you're going back to the DC-6. Well, he went back there for a while and was finally able to come back and upgrade. Now, as you all know, the 727 will come out of the sky, and the old saying is, if you can see the runway, you can land on it. Well, that's mostly true, although one time I did disprove that. I was just a little too high and couldn't get it slowed down, so I did the thing of going around. Now, I have landed out of very steep approaches. Now, let's talk about this dinosaur airplane here, the F-104. God, I love this airplane. And I went up and flew with some shuttle astronauts and X-15 pilots. And first time I flew with Bill Dana, and we're doing simulated shuttle approaches. Actually, we're coming down a little steeper than the shuttle because we have a little more drag. We started this thing at 30,000 feet. It's 1360. We got the gear down, full flaps, full speed brakes, and idle power. And the 104... it doesn't have much of a wing. It's got a little bit more, I think it's about 8 square feet more of wing area than my Great Lakes, but it's a lot heavier. Okay, so I'm doing these shuttle approaches. Bill Dana shows me one, and okay, demonstrates it. Now I'm coming around, and you flew it at 280, and you kind of played the L over D to mess with your aim point, and your aim point would really move. So I roll out on final, coming down at 12,000 feet per minute, and I said to Bill, Bill, when did you say to flare? I forgot. Okay. He said 2,500 feet or when you get scared, whichever occurs first, and for me, they came together. So I'm doing 280 knots, and I start the flare at approximately 2,500 feet, and this altimeter is unwinding, like you wouldn't believe, like that. So I start the flare. I go from 280 to 180, 2.5 seconds, 2.5 G flare, get a nice touchdown, put it into burner, go up, and we do a couple more. Well, you can land out of a very steep approach. Okay, I think we all know that. Wasn't quite as successful for K-Meyer going into Salt Lake City. Now, he was coming in on 3-4 left, and I don't have the approach plates back from the late 60s, but this is kind of basically the layout and, kind of the approach. And back then, investigating this accident, this was before the NTSB. We got the Civil Aeronautics Board, and they had the accident report, and it's very interesting. It's very interesting to read how they addressed this accident. Now they pulled a lot of data off the flight recorder, and we'll talk about this a little closer here. All right, as you can probably you know figure out, the green arrow there points to what would be the normal glide slope, and the red arrow points to what these guys were doing. They were coming down very steep, and they had very high rates of descent, and they were several thousand feet above the glide path on the way in. And this is the one thing that all co-pilots know about this accident. Okay, the co-pilot was flying, but he wanted to add power, and the captain stopped him from applying power. The co-pilot pushed the throttles up, the captain pulled him back. And only too late did the captain actually apply power. And of course, it takes, these are turbojet engines. They're not like props that come up almost instantly. They take a little bit, 5 to 8 seconds to start to spool up, especially when they're sitting there at idle. And of course, Captain Kmeyer during the whole investigation said, well, the engines didn't come up, they didn't respond and stuff like that. Well, the engines were pretty severely damaged, but it was basically he didn't add till too late. Now, here's from the accident report. Okay, they said a stabilized approach speed of 123 knots was reached 7,800 feet, slightly less than 2 minutes from impact. Now, this is at flaps 40, and those of you who have flown the 727 know that flaps 40 is a really high drag configuration, and a lot of people are scared of it, but it was a very interesting flap setting to use because you could land and stop the aircraft very well. I used it typically if I had very poor landing conditions, a lot of snow, slick runway and stuff like that. In fact, I had one second officer. I said, we're going into Albany, and it was snowing to beat the band, and I said, I'm going to do a flaps 40 landing. And she says, no, we can't do that. And I go, yeah, we can. I'm a line check airman. We can. Trust me. And she says, well, no, we can't. I go, yes, we can. And a few minutes later, she comes back and says, well, I guess people just don't want to do them. Maybe that's why I thought we couldn't, because she had looked in the book and saw, yes, we can do them. Okay, well, the nice thing about that is I landed in the snowstorm, and you get a lot of compliments like that when you get a nice landing and the conditions are really bad. So anyway, well, I digress. Back to the report. Okay, so they're coming down 123 knots, but they're high. And they were 7,800 feet, slightly less than 2 minutes before impact. During the last 1.5 minutes of the approach, the rate of descent exceeded 2,000 feet per minute, and average excess of 2,300 feet per minute. Now, this says they impacted, which is part of the problem here. They impacted at 4.7 Gs. And you notice, I think somebody had a negative sign there, and in the report, they put a little plus there, because that was a mistake. Yeah, very nice proofreading on your reports here. Later in the report, it's interesting, in an attachment, they said they hit at 8.9 Gs. The interesting thing about this was a survivable accident. There were egress issues that came into play in this accident. Now, this is what totally blew my mind away, that they would even address this. Okay, so, they're talking about the spool up time, but, it takes about 5 seconds to get 50% power because, these things spool up slowly, and then you get a lot of thrust. Anybody who's familiar with this, if you've gone from idle to, full power, it sets there and kind of comes up. Any T-37 pilots out there with the 18 seconds from idle to full power know that, yeah, it can seem like an eternity. But then as you get in the last few seconds, that's when it really comes in. But they did this test, which it amazes me they would even consider it. Okay, they did various performance curves approximating the accident conditions. They developed these from flight test data. They indicated that idle thrust is required to maintain a stabilized approach rate of descent 2,300 feet per minute. Well, that's kind of obvious. That's what they were doing. They were trying to get the airplane down, and that's the descent rate they got at idle thrust in this flap configuration. Now, but from this condition, it's possible to initiate a flare at 148 feet and land with 0 sink rate without adding power. This requires that the pilot rotate and maintain the aircraft in a stick shaker attitude. You got to be kidding me. Which would produce an average acceleration of 1.27 Gs. I did 2.5 in the F-104 throughout the maneuver. While this will result in some airspeed decay, the touchdown occurs well above the stalling speed. Well, that's good to know next time I'm going to land in Salt Lake City in my 727. But if you want a more, and this would stop me, if you want a more normal recovery from such a rate of descent, that can be accomplished by flaring at an average landing flare rate of approximately 1.06 Gs and adding sufficient power to maintain constant airspeed throughout the maneuver. This landing would require action by the pilot at 375 feet with a maximum power requirement 50% takeoff thrust occurring at an altitude of 50 feet. You gotta be kidding me that they would even consider talking about such actions as this. Any modern airline pilot who's looking at this goes, didn't they know about stabilized approaches? All right. Well, company procedures recommend, okay, the word recommend, that the pilot, where possible, maintain a descent with reference to the ILS glide slope. Okay, this will aid in maintaining the suggested 600 to 800 feet. Suggested 600 to 800 feet rate per minute descent on landing approaches. Okay, pilots are warned that higher rate of descents tolerable with a flare from 50 feet is just under 2,000 feet per minute and requires takeoff power to keep the speed at 1.3 VS, which is the approach speed, so you don't above stall. Obviously, this is a hazardous condition and should not be allowed to develop. Okay, well, we're going to talk about stabilized approaches. And even when I was hired in 79, even when I come on, yeah, they talked about stabilized approaches, and they were a really good idea. But I one time, as a 37 co-pilot in the late 80s, I pulled the powered idle at top of descent. We're going into some outfield that, is not very busy, so, they clear you to descend without much restrictions. And I was idle power at the top of descent, and I wanted to get, some power in to stabilize the power on short final, but I ended up landing in idle power. I did not touch the power from the top of descent all the way down. Well, that's kind of cool. That's kind of fun, but that's not the way you're supposed to be flying an airliner. And captain never said a thing other than that was a nice approach. All right. Well, here's another thing that was interesting. If you want to know where rules and laws and stuff like this come from, this accident produced something you're probably all familiar with. Well, this is where the FAA got it right. They issued an order that pilots in command, this is where the 100-hour rule came from, because the pilot had, I think, 84 hours. It said the co-pilot had 84 hours, and the captain was fairly inexperienced in the aircraft also. So they established 100 hours minimum level before the captain could allow the co-pilot to execute takeoff, approach, and landing. Okay, and the training requirements in turbojet aircraft, and they also required minimum number of landings in the checkout to be 35, which could be reduced to 25. So anybody who's had a checkout recently is very familiar with this, and this occurred from the accident way back in 1965. Well, let's go to more modern times. Okay, this is out of the Flight Operations Manual for my airline, United Airlines, and it details a stabilized approach. So you're not going to do approaches like this. You're not going to know that, hey, if I'm going to flare, I better start at 375 feet, to kill my 2,000 rate per minute descent. And of course, this landing occurred 40 minutes after sunset. And as you know, the darker it gets, the poorer your depth perception gets, and that's not the time to be doing high-speed descents. But the interesting thing about it, and right above my head, you will see if the approach is not stabilized, and it gives the criteria in the left there are a lot of little things, but if it's not stabilized or becomes more than momentarily unstabilized, a go-around must be executed. Okay, there's no ifs, ands, or buts. If you're not stabilized, you're going around. And they found that shooting unstabilized approaches actually led to quite a few accidents back in the day. So that's the report. And the interesting thing about this report is, okay, it assigned blame. Well, usually in an NTSB type of report, there's a lot of people that are given suggestions, call it blame if you want, but saying, we got a lot of ways we could improve this. Well, guess what happened on this one? And okay, you can't argue that, yeah, the captain's ultimately responsible, but the probable cause was the failure of the captain to take timely action to arrest an excessive rate of descent during the landing approach. Well, I think there's some supervisory action that could have been involved here too. Now, okay, the captain didn't have a good training record. He had a lot of problems. He had a lot of issues. But you know, if you pass the check rides and fill the squares, um, you know, the guy's going to fly. That's kind of unfortunate. But there should have been more supervision and more of an aspect of, hey, we got to watch this guy, and we have to mandate that you don't fly approaches like this. You have to be stabilized. And now there's one other interesting thing that kind of blew my mind away on this accident report of going. That's really how airlines operated back then. And I flew my first time on a 727 about 2 to 3 years after this accident. But this is an interesting point that they brought out, and I had no idea about this. All right. The impact of the crash did not produce any traumatic injuries. Now, there was another little part here about, flame retardant materials and materials that don't produce toxic fumes in the aircraft. But that still was a while to come. But they said everybody could have escaped. And one of the problems was, and this is what's interesting, the speed with which the passengers progressed towards the exit that prevented the stewardess, before we had, these are before flight attendants, prevented the stewardess from reaching her assigned duty station for evacuation. What do you mean? Why weren't they sitting next to the emergency exits? And actually, in this report, it talks about how the second officer came out of the cockpit, essentially pushed people away, and opened the front door because the main gear collapsed during this thing, and they couldn't get out the aft air stairs, which they tried to use, but they couldn't get those more than like 8 inches down. And I guess there's a talk about the flight attendant actually went down there and waved her hand so somebody could come and help rescue the people. And that was delaying them getting it out. But following the accident, the stewardess recommended that they be seated near emergency exits for all takeoffs and landings. Really? They weren't? Okay. Doesn't provide much use there. This must have been back when they thought it was more important to serve drinks than it was for the safety of the passengers. And this practice has been adopted by UAL's standard procedure on all 727 flights. Well, might be a nice thing to do this industry-wide. Okay, so I'm a dinosaur. Now, one interesting thing came about this that a lot of people may not remember is back in the 60s, the 727 got a very bad rap. And I remember reading a Time magazine article, and one of the things they were criticized were running the fuel lines near the belly. Of course, the engines are on the tail. Running the fuel lines and the power lines near the belly, and that because it hit so hard and there was some rupturing there, that resulted in the fire that these lines should be repositioned. I don't think that design was ever incorporated because the FAA countered that no, it wasn't really necessary. So I don't remember any redesign of the systems, but that was kind of before my time anyway. Anyway, this is a very famous airline accident, at least for myself as a new pilot at United at the time. And it was an example of, the captain interfering with the co-pilot, trying to add power on the approach and also unstabilized approaches. But it was a while before the lesson of stabilized approaches was really understood. It was realized in the 50s and 60s that these were slick aircraft, and you needed to get things stabilized. It wasn't a straight wing with props that could respond rapidly. You needed to get it stabilized. Anyway, thanks for watching. I hope you found it informative.